In the silent heart of the night, beneath the weight of betrayal and years of buried fury, a plan long in the making finally erupts. No screams. No mercy. Just the cold precision of a mind that has stopped forgiving. What begins as a game of love twists into a calculated act of vengeance, a trap that strips away every mask, crushes every defense, and forces a man to face the ruin of his own deceit. This isn't a moment of anger. It's an execution. The blindfold came off like a sentence being read aloud. For a moment the light seemed too honest, too precise, as if it had been calibrated to strip every soft edge away from the room and leave only the hard facts. Tomas blinked and the facts crowded him, photographs taped in grids along the walls, dates scrawled in red ink, messages printed out and pinned like butterflies, little camera lenses winking in corners where corners ought not to have been noticed. The air tasted metallic, the kind of copper tang that made throat and memory fuse. Everything in that room was arranged to speak the single word he had tried for months to deny. He understood immediately that he was not the protagonist of a crisis but the subject of an autopsy. The images played over and over, in patient loops, each frame magnifying a moment he had persuaded himself to forget. There was movement, but no sound. There was a choreography of gestures and lighting meant to puncture, to catalogue. There was Eva in the sunlight of a cafe where they had thought themselves invisible, her hand in his, a shadowed smile he had allowed to be private. There was the hotel hallway, slow and anonymous, rendered here as proof instead of memory. There were messages retrieved and reprinted, sentences torn from late-night convenience, words clipped out of context until they looked like weapons. Every proof was a small, immovable nail hammered into the coffin of whatever Tomas had once believed his life to be. The first wave was humiliation, cold and crystalline. It radiated outward from his belly and made his limbs heavy with shame. Shame became anger so quickly that he hardly had time to recognize the shift. It was as if the room transmuted his emotions into instruments, shame sharpened into self-blame, anger combusted into panic, panic calcified into a kind of rational horror. He lunged at the door, emotion driven by an old, reflexive belief that force could erase consequence, that pressure could unmake the dam he had broken. The door yielded nothing but the loneliness of its mechanism. Behind him, the lock had clicked, and the sound was small but complete. Cat had left. Cat had locked the world in and walked away. This was no crime of passion. Everything in that room argued otherwise. The arrangement was surgical, the timing, immaculate. The cameras did not miss a single sequence. The screens that glowed with his life showed slow replays and freeze frames as if to teach him how each choice had congealed into this moment. Cat had not set out to wound. She had set out to demonstrate the arithmetic of betrayal, the full sum of what a lie costs when it accrues interest. Her revenge was not a roar but an account statement. The ledger was posted on the walls and Tomas was face to face with his balance due. In the beginning, he searched for agency like a drowning man searching for a breath. He catalogued excuses mentally, work stress, loneliness, a lapse, a mistake, a moment that had not been meant to mean anything. Each rationalization found its counter-evidence on a nearby screen. For every mitigator he thought he could conjure, the room offered another frame, another message, another timestamp. The neatness of it sickened him. He had been careful, carefulness had failed. The knowledge that he had been seen, tracked, and compiled felt like another betrayal layered atop his own. He had believed himself cleverer than consequence. Now he watched the proof that he had only been careful enough to create a more elaborate trap for himself. As the hours crawled and the screens looped, a more subterranean narrative began to form inside Tomas, one not of facts but of identity. He had always defined himself by competence, by the neatness of his public persona. That scaffolding cracked under the strain of the evidence. He had been a man of craft in his workplace, a man of manners in public, a man who kept tidy accounts of the ways he failed so as to hide them. That tidy accounting had been revealed as apocryphal. The more he tried to push away what was playing on the glass and in the photographs, the more he felt the contours of a deeper, dormant shame unspooled, a memory of decisions made not from cruelty but from cowardice. He had sought convenience over confrontation, ease over truth, and the calculus now returned as a brutality. Kat's absence in the room was a presence in itself. It was a statement of confidence that she did not need to witness his collapse to ensure it would happen. She had arranged for dissemination, emails, hand-delivered packets, copies sent to colleagues, to mutual friends, to people whose pity had been a quiet ballast for his life. He imagined the ripple outward, contacts opening packets at their desks, surprise curdling into judgment, co-conspiracies of silence dissolving into a schedule of interrogation. The thought of strangers looking at him and recognizing his face not as someone to be known but as a scandal conjured a new, corrosive fear. This was not simply the loss of a lover's goodwill. This was the demolition of a social architecture he had thought secure. Sleep did not come. When the first exhaustion loosened his muscles, his mind braided together all the small indignities of the past months into a single, relentless narrative. He saw, with unusual clarity, the earliest signs of a fracture. The way he had stopped telling Kat about decisions he made, the small omissions that had grown into whole rooms of a house she no longer inhabited. He saw as well the precision in the way those omissions were cultivated, an anecdote left unshared, a message deleted, a meeting scheduled without mention. None of it had been monstrous in isolation. It had accumulated, like water shaping stone, into a canyon between them. Pressure grew in Tomas as if constructed by the room itself. The air was a measured thing, controlled ventilation cycling like a metronome. Hunger gnawed with a thin, focused insistence. He had not been fed, had not been given water in any systematic way, and those small deprivations sharpened thought into something harsher. Deprivation reduced his thoughts to essentials, how to escape, how to explain, whether a life built on secrets could be rebuilt. The body reacted in predictable ways, tremor in the hands, an ache behind the eyes, the slow erosion of cognitive elasticity. Without the ability to appeal, to explain, to argue, his mind turned inward and found a theater of accusations. Kat's orchestration extended beyond physical entrapment. She had staged narrative violence designed to break him economically and socially. He discovered, through a solitary packet left obvious in the center of the room, that copies of the evidence were prepared to be released to those whose opinion mattered most. The packet included not only photographs and video stills but also financial records, proof of misallocated company time, email chains that suggested a pattern of deception and disregard. The inclusion of such material suggested a strategy of ruin that was both antiseptic and merciless. She did not speak of vengeance as an emotional catharsis, she presented it as a systematic unraveling. It made the revenge less dramatic and therefore more certain. Memory is a traitor in times like these, selective and dishonest. Tomas found himself turning not to the moment of betrayal but to pre-betrayal, to the thousand tiny acts that made betrayal plausible. He recalled the first time his avoidance had refused to answer a question about where he had been. He remembered the thrill that had come from secrecy, the sudden aliveness in a life grown dulled by predictability. The thrill now felt like poison. He examined his motives with a kind of feverish autopsy. There was no grand theme of malice, only a string of selfishnesses, convenience-driven calculus, a refusal to risk pain by risking truth. The moral clarity Kat applied to his life made the admission of culpability more painful than the physical confinement. Underneath the humiliation there was also a growing algebra of dread. If Kat sent the materials to their community, what of his position at work? What of the people who had counseled him, who trusted him with budgets, decisions, human resources? He pictured their faces in rows of offices, the collapse of professional networks, the practical weeds that grow after reputation dies. Reputation is not a poetic thing, it is a ledger of trust. When trust evaporates, contracts and opportunities and the small habitual kindnesses that lubricate daily life dry up. The prospect of that loss made him dizzy in a way that anger alone never had. Kat's revenge was better conceived than it was felt. She did not seek to humiliate for spectacle, she sought to purge. There was a grim, almost clinical morality to what she had prepared. The arrangement looked practiced, the way evidence was curated, how the emotional crescendo had been designed to hit exactly where he would feel it most. The cruelty lay in the efficacy. She had become, through pain, a surgeon of consequence, someone who diagnosed the rot and excised it. The knowledge of her competence made anything like reconciliation improbable. If she had intended to teach, she had succeeded with a merciless diplomacy. Inside the room, time became a wire tightened with each rotation of the clock. Tomas sat on the concrete floor and let his heartbeat be the only measure of time. He observed small things with a new, fierce attention, the pattern of light through the blinds when a car passed outside, the dust motes in a single sunbeam, the way his breath fogged in front of his face in a line of condensation. These became talismans against the larger annihilation. He began to catalogue not only his guilt but the elements that might anchor him beyond this rupture, a colleague who might believe him, a friend who might offer shelter, an argument he could make when he had voice. The list kept him alive in a way that anger could not. And yet beneath the marrow of survival there grew a different, darker impulse. If he had been capable of deception, then perhaps deception could now be his salvation. He imagined the contours of a counterplot, the retrieval of evidence, the challenge to the provenance of the recordings, an appeal to legalism and theatrics. He rehearsed these possibilities like spells, circling them until they felt less like fantasies and more like plans. Each plan required someone outside, a partner in disbelief who would open a door or provide a story. The more tangible those plans became, the more they lent shape to a future that had, until a few hours prior, looked irredeemable. The hours turned into a long, slow stripping of pretenses. Tomas recognized how habits had composed a life that was neither entirely false nor entirely true. He had lived in the liminal spaces where commitments could be deferred and loyalties could be weighed against convenience. That architecture collapsed in the glow of the screens. The realization had an odd clarity. Every choice had consequences, and consequence was now a public performance with him as the unwilling star. It was a humiliating clarity that carried an odd relief too. The kind that comes from seeing the truth even when that truth devours you. Outside the room, the world prepared to respond. Kat did not savor her victory in private, she administered it publicly. Notices were sent, named packets were dispatched, and the first murmurs of speculation began to sketch themselves across social feeds and office corridors. The deliberate speed of her distribution suggested an awareness of the rhythms that govern disgrace, shock first, then curiosity, then the slow ratification of gossip into accepted fact. She timed release to maximize the damage, to intersect with lunch hours, with the moment when people are most mobile with their attention. Tomas imagined the cascade of sliding doors, the lowering of heads, the narrowing of eyes, the discreet gestures of distancing that mark the beginning of a social death. He thought of Eva, not as an abstract rival now but as someone whose life had been entangled with his in a way that could not be unspooled. The thought was not just of pain but of responsibility. He had implicated her by his actions, and whatever fallout came would land on her as well. The knowledge added another layer to his shame. He had not only betrayed a partner, he had used another person's intimacy for his convenience. The imagery of Eva's face, bright and unguarded in the photographs, haunted him. He felt the cruelty of his choices sharpen into a sorrow that had nothing theatrical about it. It was ordinary grief, complicated, private, and irreplaceable. As night deepened and the city beyond the room dimmed into an indifferent hum, Tomas moved through a landscape of resignation and resolve. The cage surrounding him was made of facts and of the perceptions those facts would produce. He had been reduced to a subject of study by a woman who knew him better than perhaps he had known himself. He was furious at the spectacle, but he was, in an almost obscene way, grateful for the clarity. The wreckage had exposed the rot. It had also made the boundaries visible. He could no longer muddle truth and omission into a life, he had to choose what to do with the exposed remains. When the door finally opened hours later, not by Kat's hand but by a security officer who had been instructed to deliver a final packet, Tomas stepped out into a world that was already altered. The light felt different, as if filtered through glass. People saw him and their faces adjusted, their mouths forming opinions in micro-increments. He realized, in that first dizzy step, that redemption would not be immediate and might not be possible at all. The path ahead would demand a work ethic of confession and repair that he had never known. He would have to live under the gravity of his choices and the measure of another woman's righteousness. Kat's revenge had not been theatrical, it had been meticulous. It had reduced a life into components and shown him which pieces were salvageable and which were irretrievably corroded. The violence of it was not in physical harm but in the dismantling of the scaffolding he had built around his identity. The room had been a crucible, and he came out on the other side not cleansed but changed, lighter in the way that rubble is lighter than a standing building, stripped of illusions, exposed to the landscape of difficult choices. He carried with him the knowledge that some betrayals could be repaired only by an unrelenting process of reckoning, and that some wounds leave contours that no reconciliation could erase. In the weeks that followed, reputations recalibrated, alliances shifted, and people chose sides in small, mundane ways. Tomas learned how precarious social currency was, how quickly colleagues became cautious, how friendships required labor to remain intact. He also learned, uncomfortably, that cruelty can be bureaucratic. Kat's revenge had moved through systems, emails, files, forwarded messages, scheduled reveals. It had been procedural and relentless. It had been, in its own way, efficient. And though the pain did not disappear, Tomas found in the rubble a strange engine of accountability. He could see, with a painful honesty, what had to be undone. He began, awkwardly and soberly, to rebuild from a foundation of admitted truth. The process was slow, often humiliating, and rarely gratifying. It required that he accept the consequences without crafting justifications. It demanded that he be patient in a way that felt foreign, patient with trust, patient with the slow return of normalcy, patient with the fact that some doors he had closed could not be reopened no matter how sincere his remorse. Kat watched the consequences she had set in motion. She had not needed to be present in the room to ensure his collapse. She had engineered the conditions for his unraveling and then allowed the world to perform the rest. There was a sternness to her victory that had nothing to do with spectacle, it had to do with equilibrium. She had taken back what had been taken and returned it in a manner both public and deliberate. The revenge had done its work not by annihilation but by exposure, by insisting that what is hidden be seen and weighed. In the aftermath, both of them lived with new, narrower truths. Tomas learned the cost of secrecy and the labor required to reconstruct a life with its fractures visible. Kat learned the weight of carrying evidence and the emptiness that can follow a long-anticipated retribution. The damage was finite and real, so too was the discipline that would be needed to move beyond it. The final lesson was not poetic. Revenge had closed one chapter, but it had also rewritten the rules for how both would live their lives forward, less gilded, more honest, and marked by the knowledge that every choice casts a shadow long enough to cross another person's life.